Did you know the euro area and the EU both grew at the fastest pace in a decade last year?
And this growth is forecast to continue this year and the next. But for the prognosis for our gross domestic product, or GDP as we know it, to prove accurate, this recovery needs to be deep for citizens in all 28 EU countries.
Senior economists compare GDP to a car's speedometer. It can tell you your speed, but will not indicate if you are about to have engine trouble, break down, or get hit.
As Mr. Spock, that's a Star Trek reference for all you non-Trekkies out there would say, insufficient facts always invite danger. So we've put together a few indicators of what's being forecast across the horizon.
Looking out, through the European Commission's latest forecast lens, growth is predicted to continue. Consumers and businesses are more positive as global economies grow. Headline inflation, which includes higher oil and food prices, are expected to rise, but strip them out and you're left with core inflation that should stay low. But European consumer demand is expected to continue to drive growth in 2018, helping sustain development across industries, sectors and countries. Access to cheap financing should also help businesses, thereby helping investments to increase. That means businesses can export more to consumers around the world despite an expensive and strong euro, potentially creating more jobs too. All EU countries are expected to grow in 2018. But risks remain, from Brexit to geopolitical tensions to financial rules getting stricter, all going into next year. So that's one view. I'm going to get another from Angel Gurria, Secretary General of the OECD at their headquarters in Paris.
Mr. Gurria, we set you a challenge of bringing an object. You've brought two to describe what you think the challenge for European growth is. Could you explain them?
You can very easily underestimate Europe, but you should look under the scaffolding. You save money for 3 years to go to Europe, and then you get to Notre Dame or to Il Duomo in Milan or the cathedral in Köln, and then it's covered with the scaffolding, you know. But then you come back 3 years later, and they have finished, you know. This is the view of Europe always. Reinventing itself, redesigning itself, strengthening itself, but always work in progress, you know, with a hard hat and always the trowel.
Well, we didn't plan for this real stuff, but how convenient that Gianni Maggi is off in Ireland exploring how the construction industry is helping drive the economic recovery there, and is looking at whether this is a case of the luck of the Irish being back, or as some people are describing it, perhaps the Celtic phoenix.
Everywhere you look in Dublin today, there are cranes, a sight that wasn't so plentiful when the financial crisis hit Ireland in 2008. Construction slowed considerably, and then it almost stopped. But in 2013, the Celtic Tiger began its slow and steady comeback.
At the height of construction output, we ran at about 25% of the GDP. At the downturn, or the lowest ebb of the downturn, that reduced to 3%. Currently, we're running at about somewhere between 6 to 7%. But economists would believe that we should be up at somewhere between 12 to 15%. So obviously there's still a gap in terms of reaching that sustainable construction output.
The upsurge is also being seen in other areas. Exports broke all records last year. Household consumption is up. Unemployment is near pre-crisis levels, and wages are also creeping up. So does the construction industry think this bodes well for the growth it's seeing?
So there's a recognition of trying to get that balance between private development and obviously government and infrastructure. The infrastructure is absolutely necessary for everything else to happen.
Keeping this growth sustainable comes down to the core fundamentals of the economy, and the Irish have some aspects that makes theirs quite unique. Figures showing Ireland's return to growth are distorted by the activity of large multinationals that have settled here mainly for tax reasons. But even if you subtract the effect of business that multinationals carry on outside the country, the real figure for domestic growth is still twice the European average. But there are still big challenges ahead, from new fiscal discipline rules to Brexit.
The unknown, of course, is exactly what Brexit scenario we face, and that is a major source of uncertainty and risk. And certainly from an Irish perspective, the harder the Brexit, the more severe will be the economic consequences. But even allowing for Brexit impacts over the medium to long term, the Irish economy is likely to be able to continue to grow.
But it all, of course, depends on whether that growth is deep-rooted enough that it can withstand the inevitable global risks.
But if I look at the medium term, we're seeing wage growth not happening. You've got subdued inflation. Do you see this being an issue?
The question of wages has been a problem in Japan, the United States, in Mexico, in Europe. Why? Because you had, first of all, technology, which is moving always against in a way of additional job creation. You basically are trying to create an environment that is attractive to do business, where there's appropriate skilled labor that can feed into these demands. We calculate that over the next 10, 15 years, between 10 and 14% of the workforce is in danger of being displaced. Another 30% of the workforce may be disrupted in their day-to-day activities.
You see the trade wars that are starting to build. Do you see that as a risk, and how dependent does Europe now have to be on generating domestic demand?
Wars are all bad. Engaging in dialogue for the substantive solution of the problem. Why? Because otherwise you're just going to be trying to hit the manifestation. Every time, every year, every 2 years, there'll be a flare-up of the manifestations. If you don't address the real problem, Europe is not engaged in trade wars at this stage. Hopefully it won't be. But the question is, how does one plan forward?
How does Europe do that if one of its key members is leaving, as we know it is? What would you rank as a major risk? Brexit, the US, relationships, or something else altogether?
The US relationship is crucial because it's a very, very important client. Brexit is disruptive. The UK will always be a very important trading partner of Europe, and they're going to continue to be a very, very important economic reality for the whole of Europe. A decade, has been, lost in the struggle of the recovery of the crisis, and it still has its legacy. You have growing inequalities, and you have a very serious drop in the confidence level of people in their own governments, in their own institutions.
Mr. Gurria, thank you very much for those insights and joining us on the show, and thank you for coming along for the ride. We'll catch you next time.